Well, good morning and welcome to this FS Club webinar coming out of London. I have with me our guest today, Tim Stocks from James Stocks & Co. And we're going to be discussing the future of work. Is the office building obsolete? Now, we've certainly heard over the last 13 and 14 months that there's a strong possibility that we may never, ever go back to offices again. And yet I think deep down we know that's not the case. There is a transformation going on, and we want to explore that today. Now, you know me, I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the directors of Zien, and it really is my privilege to be able to introduce so many of these webinars, principally because our sponsors, whom you can see here, allow us to range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance. And hitherto, it's always been seen that this would be based very much around the office. But Tim is going to talk about his views as somebody who's deep into this space on what that might really mean. So I'm going to get out of your way as quickly as possible so that you can hear from the expert, but just a few moments of housekeeping. Firstly, the slides are available already, in fact, on the website, and will be available thereafter. There is a recording being made, and it will go up in approximately 48 working hours. Sorry, for 48 hours, not working hours. So hopefully be up Wednesday evening. And we will be having, as ever, a discussion of approximately 20 minutes with Tim. So please do feed your comments, questions, and observations through in the GoToWebinar question facility. Please don't email me, WhatsApp, Signal. I'm here with you, so we'll only get those afterwards. Please do put them all in. All of your questions and comments will be sent with your email to Tim. So if you want to get in touch with him or pip him, just put it in there and I will make sure that he gets it later today. So with no more ado, Tim, the floor is very much yours.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you very much for the introduction there. In thinking about today's talk, I've been thinking very much about the tributes that were paid to His Royal Highness Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, recently. And one of his quoted bon mots was from 1969, when opening a new building in Canada. He said, "I declare this thing open, whatever it is." Unintentionally, he summed up the status of much of the real estate market today, from retail through to the office building. Next slide, please, Michael. So what is the purpose of real estate today? Are we going to be repurposing office buildings as residential blocks or entire gymnasiums? And what about retail? Well, we won't be discussing retail today. We'll be just focusing on the office building and the future of work. It's a wide-ranging discussion and one that could last much longer than the allotted time this morning. And of course, the conclusions reached will only be confirmed one way or the other with the benefit of hindsight. So, for instance, in a year's time, will the City of London return to being the busy hive of activity that we're used to, or a place to watch tumbleweed blow carelessly along Bishopsgate? We believe that much of the answer lies in human nature rather than financial models and government regulation. We refer in particular to early philosophers who looked at the wisdom of human nature, and Cicero, the Roman philosopher, said early on, "From the beginning, nature has assigned to every type of creature the tendency to preserve itself, and in man it drives a desire to meet together and congregate." And we think that that desire to meet together and congregate means that the future of the office building is probably, underline probably, assured. But why do we reach those conclusions? Well, in interviews in the Daily Telegraph last week, young people were asked to comment on their views on a return to the office, and the following quotes appeared. One person said, I'm craving a creative office environment." And another said, "I'm fed up with working from home." Whilst a third said, "I'm desperate to meet new colleagues, having just started my new job, and I want to go out for lunch with them and for a drink after work. Hallelujah, we all say to that. But this will only happen when normal returns. And I suppose one question that we need to deal with is, when will the pandemic be over? Here in the UK, we're probably reaching a point where it's the end of the pandemic, but we have seen the dreadful situation evolving in India, and the stock market this morning is down about 19 points because of concerns about a rise of COVID infections in East Asia, in particular Thailand, Japan, and South Korea, all of which are main centers of semiconductor manufacturing as well, which could have an impact on technology firms across the world. So when is it that we can reach this new normal and then think about return to work? Is it when the government says so? Or is it when we as a society determine that the risk of infection is so diminished that the risk of return to daily life can continue and resume? The comment I heard was, we may be able to go to the pub, but will we? And I think that's a key question that drives the discussion about a return to normality. In considering today's talk, we had to consider at the outset what we meant by obsolete or obsolescence. And so we started by trying to define our terms. And we are going to consider obsolete both as an investment class, is it somewhere to deploy capital any longer, and also obsolete as a place of work. But first, we would like you to participate, if you could, in a poll, just to start understanding what people on the ground are thinking in terms of when the pandemic will be over. So we have a short, oh, sorry, Michael.
Tim, I've launched that poll. So when do you consider the pandemic to be over? Is it when governments say so, when 70% of the world is vaccinated, when everybody over 30 in the UK is vaccinated, or when everyone ignores COVID restrictions? As ever, FS Club votes rapidly. So just do type in there, folks. We're well over the 50% mark. I'll leave this open for just a few more seconds, Tim, to catch more responses. That's great. Well over 3/4 of the audience have voted. And I'm now just going to close the poll and share the results. And so you can see here that nearly half the audience, 48%, believe when 70% of the world population is vaccinated.
Fantastic. That is interesting. Thank you for that, everybody. Perhaps we can go to the next slide, Michael. So, of course, this is not the first time the world, or indeed the United Kingdom, has suffered from a pandemic. Pandemics have impacted the human race probably since we started standing up, which is evidently some 33 million years ago. The ancient Greeks suffered pandemics, the Byzantines suffered pandemics, and of course in the 1340s we had the Black Death in Europe, and in 1665 the bubonic plague, and of course about a century ago we had the Spanish flu as well. But we think, looking back and looking for precedent, the development of the English village is a metaphor for today's office building. A village was more of a horizontal community as opposed to the office building being vertical. But we think a lot of the same social interactions that drive what's going to happen will also become apparent as we move out of the current pandemic. So just an interesting stat. After the Black Death of 1340, 1,300 villages in England were deserted, and people did not return to those villages. Those villages perhaps therefore become a metaphor for today's office building. And therefore, perhaps in the same way, not all office buildings will return to the purpose for which they were originally intended. But also importantly, after sessions of plague, these were followed by upheavals in society with innovations in technology and public health. So if you go back to 1340, for instance, people found that you no longer needed to grow arable crops, but one man and a dog and a few sheep would suffice, and therefore you could become more productive with less labour. Of course, an important fact when something like 15% of the city of London was decimated by the bubonic plague. So coming out of plagues, we do see social change, whether it's improvements in overall health of the population, improvements in productivity, improvement in real wages, falls in food prices, goods and housing, and a reduced gap between the rich and the poor. But what we also see is that post-plague, people still do come together and work together. They don't carry on with the social distancing and separation and shielding. So if you take the example of London from 1665, the bubonic plague was part of a globalized plague and came to the UK as a result of globalization. But post-pandemic, London became a hub where people still came together, merchants with capital, and mingled together to create wealth and to create jobs and to increase the GDP of the nation. And we don't see any reason why that won't continue post this pandemic. But, next slide please, this all depends, of course, on people's attitudes to returning to the office. So again, we'd like to conduct another poll if we could, Michael.
And I've just launched that, Tim. What are your intentions, folks? Do you intend to return to the office, work from home only, 1 day, 2 day, 3 day, or 4 days a week working from home? It's a little slower this time, Tim. I think people are pondering, but over half the audience have answered, or up to 2/3, hitting 3/4. Just leave it open for a few more seconds. And just going to close that and share the results, which are really quite interesting. So it would appear that the vast bulk of the audience are anticipating 2 or more days working from home.
Which I think actually bears out quite closely with what surveys are saying on the subject of, as well, which we'll come on to look at if you go to the next slide, please. So if you take the experience in the USA, prior to pandemic last spring 2020, only 5% of Americans were working from home, whereas once the pandemic hit, that number went up to 60%. And as a result of the pandemic, the number isn't going to return to the 5% it was previously. A research of American workers said that they wanted to work from home 50% of the time, which should be 2 to 3 days a week. But employers in the US are already planning, without any more ado, for people to work from home at least 1 day a week. So this is a fact of life, that there will be more flexible working. Interestingly, in a European survey, UK employees were the least likely to want to return to the office, with 72% saying that they will work remotely from home more often in the future, which doesn't mean 100% of the time. It does mean that 1 or 2 days a week they will continue to work remotely. But interestingly, the drive to return to an office environment comes from the younger generation, who feel they're not able to connect and network with their peers, and therefore that's detrimental to their career growth, as is the ability to be trained, perhaps as we all were, by sitting next to senior colleagues and seeing the way they worked and operated and working on assignments with them. That becomes far much harder with remote working. And that is perhaps another driving force behind getting people back into the office. Next slide, please. But what we did in preparing for today's talk, we had a look at what the market was saying in terms of return to work. And we divided the categories into three. Those who were saying, you must come back in. Those who were sitting on the fence saying, well, maybe. And those who were saying, look, let's get rid of these real estate costs from our P&L. Let's all work virtually. So just reading left to right on the screen, Goldman Sachs, Barclays, and Asset Management at JP Morgan Chase all saying, employees must come back, concerned over the long-term impact of remote working, mentioning the possible lack of energy people get from not being around their peer group. Sitting on the fence, Facebook and an insurance company, Aviva, interestingly, are opting for a hybrid model, offering greater flexibility and independence for workers. Dell, again, is supporting this hybrid working model and suggesting a work from anywhere situation. And PwC UK, obviously the accounting consulting firm with its 22,000 staff in the UK, are saying that people can split their time half and half between home and office after the pandemic, which chimes very much to the survey we just conducted with the 2-day-a-week working from home. Those who were saying, actually, we don't need this anymore, we can all work from home or not in an office environment. Dropbox saying that they will pursue that model. Interestingly, pharmaceutical company Novartis announced a shift from what they call manager-approved remote working to manager-informed remote working. So you just tell your boss that you're not going to be in and working from home. That will suffice there. It's not a fully virtual model, however. Obviously, it could actually straddle back into the maybe box as well. And Twitter said that all employees will be allowed to work from home, in their words, forever. But they did caveat that by saying except those in jobs requiring a physical presence, such as maintaining servers. So a range of views there. There's no one size fits all emerging in this discussion. Employers in consultation with employees are taking their own decisions, but it's clear that at some level an office space plays a role in the return to work. But then let's, next slide please. We can look at the experience elsewhere where perhaps the normal may have returned sooner than here in the UK. But in New Zealand, that we've all heard has had a really good pandemic, 27% of the workforce there has continued to work from home and not gone back to the office. In South Korea, there's only been a small percentage drop-off in workers not returning to the office as compared with pre-pandemic. In Australia, the situation is far more mixed, with employees reluctant to return and employers keen to see a return. And the City of Melbourne conducted a research study which found that 75% of city workers were reluctant to go back into the office. To help bridge the gap between home working, which we've all been in for the last year, and getting back into an office environment, tech consulting firm Slalom was suggesting that there is a kind of social gathering where you go from virtual to face-to-face meetings socially, and then there's a soft return to the office without the pressure of hitting the ground running on day one. And the Australian New Zealand branch of SAP is saying that the most important thing as far as they're concerned for a return to the office is to make employees feel safe. And on that basis, and this chimes with what the audience this morning said, 76% of workers for SAP said they plan to return to the office 2 days per week. Next slide, please. But what about office investment as an asset class for the deployment of capital? Well, again, it's a mixed picture, but if you take the high level numbers, in 2020, 9.7 billion was invested in office space or development offices in the United Kingdom. In the last quarter of 2020, 4.3 billion was transacted across London alone, with the West End showing particularly strong in that number. On the flip side of this coin, vacancy rates in London office market are expected to reach 10% in Q2 2021. And the London's vacancy rate of office space in December 2020 was 7.5%, which is slightly above the 20-year average of 7.2%. There is some evidence of downward pressure on rents at this stage, with Collier's International expecting to see modest declines in prime rents and greater falls in average rentals across London in 2021. But then let's have a look at some announcements that have come out of those developers and owners in the office market. What are they saying? Well, British Land, the bellwether of pension funds in the UK, gave a trading update on the 14th of April. It announced that it had pre-let 30% of its space at 1 Broadgate to JLL on a 15-year lease. But at the same time, they'd sold £640 million of mature office space and were looking to redeploy that capital in out-of-town retail and logistics. But in the announcement, they gave the following quote: "We are further aligning our mixed-use campuses towards innovative growth sectors and businesses. JLL's lease at 1 Broadgate demonstrates their conviction that the modern, high-quality and sustainable office space has a key role to play in promoting innovation, collaboration, training and culture." Again, there's always two sides to the story. Canary Wharf Group, having had planning permission to build a 60-storey office block in the Canary Wharf area, has applied to reschedule that planning for residential use and to create two office blocks of 700 apartments with gymnasium and other social activities included. So there is clearly a headline number in terms of money finding its way into the sector. British Land selling office space, but they found a buyer, so there's still money coming in internationally into the office space sector as well. But there's obviously some realignment going on, and perhaps at the margins, some office space being taken out of supply and being converted to alternative use. So next slide, if we could, please. So looking forward for the rest of this year, and I think slightly and beyond, what do we see happening? Well, for office space, we see shorter lease lengths being important, more flexibility in terms of leasing arrangements, break options in leases in favour of tenants become more prevalent, which is going to add to the cost of operating these office blocks as well. Just from our own experience, we were looking to take property space in Covent Garden and found a suitable building, but the landlord was wanting to lease the entire floor plate to one tenant. We asked for it to be subdivided into two, and the landlord or the landlord's agent refused. That floor space is still vacant and available for occupation by somebody, but that tells us that landlords are going to need to be more flexible in terms of the way they offer space out, perhaps smaller unit sizes, dividing floor plates up, which of course increases management cost for landlords. But just to set against that, post-pandemic, we also see a rise in the number of startup businesses who will need office space as well. So in 2020, for instance, $15 billion was invested by the VC community in UK companies, which means the UK ranks third in terms of VC investment behind the USA and China. And in terms of new company incorporations, in 2020, there were 665,495 new company incorporations. Now, not all of those businesses will last long, but some will, and they will need office accommodation, and they will need that accommodation on flexible terms and probably where they can start small and grow the space, and probably not in a kind of workspace type environment, but in a more of a what I might call stable, but I'm sure not the right word, but in their own office space, in their own office block. In terms of yields, which are important in terms of the attraction of capital, these seem to be holding firm at the moment, for prime assets and long secure income. And the weight of overseas money is responding to the value available in London markets or the security available offered by London and the UK. So our final poll, if we could, Michael.
Dee, just launching that now. If you're reluctant to return to the office, what steps would encourage your return? So the poll is now open. So would it be a low density commute, new technology on COVID security in the office, more personal space in the office, not having to attend client meetings, or no central office but working from out of town hubs? Certainly has been I think a lot of the sociologists have been claiming might be possible. Over half the audience have voted as ever. Very swift off the mark, 2/3, getting up past 3/4. I'll leave it open just a few more seconds while they make up their minds. Okay, I'm now closing the poll and sharing those results. And very much a low density commute, nearly half the audience there, thinking that is the one step that would encourage their return.
Well, that's very interesting, in that it's, we were thinking it, and we come on to talk about perhaps it's all about design of office space and making that more COVID secure. But of course, if you can't get to the office other than by cheek and jowl with a society, then that might put you off the return. So there's more of an infrastructure spend needed to sort that out, and that probably falls on government. So what are the drivers of demand for office space that we see? Well, we've touched on these: startups and businesses requiring space. We see that there might be more campus style development. So you might have a large office block, and you might that might become labeled a tech hub in some way, and therefore attract into that vertical space companies all working and collaborating around the same type of industry model. Technology, now this has long been a bane of the philosopher's life in terms of, is it a good thing or a bad thing? Obviously the Luddites thought it was a bad thing to have technology, but what we've seen is that as technology improves productivity, it also increases the demand for labour. It isn't the other way around. So there is no ceiling on the pool of the labour market. It is something that can expand like the air in a balloon. And therefore, as we get more technology, we can become more productive, we need more labour, and that labour needs space to work from. Collaboration and collaboration hubs. You can look at the City of London, for instance, as a hub. It's a hub for capital, it's a hub for insurance, it's a hub for professional services and financial services as well. And in California, you have tech hubs, and in London, you have a financial hub. So whilst it's not all in a campus, it is a hub environment where people need to be to walk around and meet people who are going to help them drive growth and profit in their business. And for that reason alone, the city centre hub will continue to be important to drive demand for office space. COVID secure, we've discussed, as along with tenants wanting smaller floor plates. The other thing that's coming out from research is that employees would like more personal space in the office. So let's get rid of the small cubicle approach and give people more floor space so they're not sitting, if you like, on top of each other in the office. And that office space needs to attract new design and new thought in design so that it can become an attractive place to work and therefore to retain and attract new talent to the business. And therefore, what are the consequences of this new demand for the office environment? Well, from an investment point of view, one can forecast that there will be increased asset management costs. In particular, if infrastructure is required, lifts outside the building, for instance, this all requires CapEx. There will be more asset management costs if you have more leases with different break clauses and different terms. And so that all needs to be managed, and that will come at a cost. As we said earlier, there will be probably a call for more flexible lease arrangements. than currently. That might lead altogether to reduced investment yield. But of course, if you can attract the right people into the building and charge a premium for that, then yield might be sustained. But from a financing point of view, there could be a lower quality rental counterparty as well, perhaps with early stage businesses, which might have an impact on financing and perhaps a drive towards lower LTVs in the market, which will require more equity funding. But of course, we've seen the rise of the real estate investment trust market in London, listed funds, and so there is capital available if there was more equity needed to bridge that gap if indeed lenders require those lower LTVs. Next slide, please. So just to draw some conclusions, and thank you very much, I've overrun my time, but it's not a topic you can quickly run through. So is the office building obsolete? As an investment class, no, but there are some things, perhaps some headwinds. Returns may be impaired for the reasons we've discussed. And for those wanting to deploy capital into the UK market for security, then there could well be a trade-off in terms of the cash yield. And at the margin, there could be some supply of office space taken out of the market as this is put to alternative use. But after the bubonic plague, people still lived in villages, even though some were deserted. And the office building as a workspace, again, no, it's not obsolete at all, but they'll need to be thinking around the design of new and refurbished space to attract talent. That must include more natural light, touchless technology, improved air conditioning and filtering systems, perhaps an emphasis on wellness and testing as well, but get rid of the cubicle. And people like to work together in one place, and they will continue to want to do that. And London is the original hub, and the need to collaborate won't disappear. There's a natural gravity that draws people into the office space. So a thought as well, perhaps to attract people in back to work. We've seen that real wages after the Black Death went up. So perhaps here we're going to see salaries increasing to attract people back in, with a greater emphasis on flexible working and a greater emphasis on wellness as well, with testing and technology improvements continuing, and therefore productivity increasing, which overall should be very positive to the UK GDP. So thank you, everybody, and sorry that I've slightly overrun my time, but it is quite a wide-ranging discussion.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for a thoughtful and nuanced talk. Neither Armageddon nor Nirvana. We've got, as you gathered, a lot of questions and comments. We won't be able to get through them all, but I'll just get cracking if I might. Greg Davis hold us up on our quick poll. What if I intend to stay in the office 5 days a week? And sorry, Greg, we only have 5 categories, sadly. But Greg goes on to point out, is it not true that many people were agile working historically, but not recognizing it? I considered myself office-based, but spent 3.5 days a week out of it. So
I think that must be right. We perhaps didn't recognize it, but there were people, if you like, out on the road. There were people who were saying, well, I'll work from home today, but it wasn't a regimented regime as such. And in the last year, the whole of society has worked from home, and therefore you've had that national effort to try it out. And I think having tried it out, people actually find it more to their liking, and therefore it will become more of the norm.
Michael Shapiro points out that the return to the office is a bit chicken and egg. We need the hospitality and leisure industry to attract people back in, but they in turn need the people to be back in. In many ways, it reminds me of Iraq or other war zones where we just don't know how to get when they're working, that's fine, but we don't know how to get them going again. Any thoughts on or suggestions for policy people on what they ought to do to unpick that chicken and egg problem?
Well, it's a difficult question. I would have thought the priority is to get people into the office space, and I think that looking at the poll, what are we doing in terms of the commute to make that happen? I think there needs some positive policy statement about public transport and dealing with that. Now, what that entails, we're not sure, but that might be staggered returns to work in terms of the time that the day starts and the time that the day finishes. It might lead to a shorter in-office working day and people getting there later, leaving sooner. But I think the starting point, just looking at the survey today, the thing that's holding people back is the thought of getting back on that tube train or that train into the office, and that needs to be the starting point.
Yeah, and Alan Punter points out you're going to need more flexible, perhaps season ticket arrangements. How's that going to work? A lot of interest here on what the commuting future is. Interesting. Graham Elliott is curious: will out-of-town hubs be killed off by companies demanding that their corporate identity be based on the location of their workers being in one place?
So I think that's again interesting. So Britannia Building Society has come out and said that all their employees don't need to go into head office. They can work from branches and use that as their local hub, which works for that type of business. But not every business has this kind of hub approach. And we've seen, as a result of people working from home, that some of the businesses that set up out of town back office hubs have seen those being closed because it's just become more of a cost with people not going there to work. So I know there's been a lot of talk around this out of town hub personally, and you can shoot me down in a year's time, but personally I don't see it working. It will work for some businesses who've already got a distributed office network, but for a lot of businesses who just have that central CBD office space, I don't see it working.
Okay. Paul Phillips is curious, how do we maintain collaborative working when people may be working 2 or 3 days in the office, but they're different days? Do you have any thoughts on how a manager would encourage the type of interaction that they're coming back for, but unable to guarantee when they'll be there?
Well, perhaps there has to be a day a week or day every 2 weeks where everybody in a team, not in a whole building, but in a team has to get together to do a kind of briefing in terms of how is it all going, who's doing what, and then allow people to continue working by Zoom or Teams or whatever the technology is at that point. But the reality is we in our business, we've worked well over the last year working on corporate finance transactions without sitting together and using Teams, and we've worked with advisor, law firms and accounting firms executing deals, and with the private equity community, and it has worked. It's not been as clunky as we feared, and we haven't needed those kind of all-night closing meetings to get deals done. So perhaps there has been a fundamental change in that people do feel able to collaborate without actually having to be next to each other any of the time.
Victoria Ward is curious, what qualities from remote working do you see as part of the design of workspaces and offices beyond, for example, personal space being enlarged? What will change in the design of offices as a result of this mass experiment? And related to that in a way, I mean, John Schlesinger points out, will there be more people in the office on Zoom? And, offices haven't traditionally been very good at that.
Well, as we said, the infrastructure of the office needs to be improved. So I think if you're an office that doesn't have efficient Zoom or Teams and an ability to hold those client meetings using that technology, then I think you're going to be at a distinct disadvantage. In terms of the design elements for office that would attract people, well, with respect, I'm not of that design world, but things that one reads, it's all about perhaps smaller breakout areas with comfortable seating, perhaps where one person can go or 1 or 2 people can go and be, perhaps less canteen at work, which might be considered less necessary, and having everybody coming together in that canteen environment might be something that doesn't continue. But you can get into. I've read articles about soft furnishings and replicating the furnishings one might have in a home environment, fabrics that are able to be quickly disinfected, or intelligent fabric that kind of might clean itself, all that good stuff. So I imagine there's a lot going on that I, for one, am not aware of.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was in a discussion recently with the Worshipful Company of Furniture Makers, and one of the things that they pointed out is that we're importing back to the home office equipment and things like that, and it's not really been designed for that. It was designed for those rabbit hutches of commercial property. So a whole opportunity to rethink that for sure. Jane Wormleighton asks, you used previous pandemics as a guide, but surely this is the first mass pandemic of the technological age. Is that not likely to make the post-pandemic working substantially different? And she imagines fewer at the office desk every day, but perhaps more face-to-face meetings and internal networking events in offices.
So I would just slightly challenge that this is the first global pandemic. I don't think it is. I think way back in time, if you look at the 1340s, 1665, they were global pandemics. It's just that statistics across the world weren't maintained in the same way. But if you look at Europe in 1665, a lot of Europe suffered, and the population of Europe, I think, fell by perhaps 20+% as a result. So this isn't the first worldwide or global pandemic by any stretch. But what we do know is that after each pandemic, there has been change, and that change has been quite remarkable. So after the 1340s, the whole feudal system in Europe collapsed, and people were able to gain access to land and be more self-sustaining and self-sufficient, rather than having to be enthralled to the manor. And that was quite a radical shift. As we pointed out, there was a move from arable farming, which is quite labor intensive, to one manor, dog and sheep, which is the equivalent of Microsoft producing the operating system for the computer. So whilst we look at things through the prism of today's technology, I think the past has a lot of lessons for us in terms of the changes that occurred, which were quite radical in their day, even though perhaps looking back from where we are today, they seem slightly pedestrian.
Robert Pay, whom I think you know, asks, if there is a conversion of office space to residential, are you expecting renewed governmental efforts to accelerate planning permission? And related to that, Peter Lewis remarks, I understand there are significant applications for change from office to residential. Is this a canary in the mine?
Well, hi, Robert. So yes, there are permitted development regimes now for office space to be converted into residential. So the planning issues there have been largely cleared away or made much easier. And therefore, I would see that trend continuing, in particular, where, if I can say, you might be looking at tertiary office buildings that perhaps have always slightly struggled, not fulfilled promise, and therefore they will be a natural target for conversion. I think in the way that they're converted to residential, one needs to be very careful. There was a Panorama program about this, whereby rapid conversion of office building to temporary social accommodation had people living in very small square foot areas, and it was largely condemned. So I do think the way that you go about converting, and it has to be quite sympathetic and to create a very good residential environment. The canary in the mine, well, yes, but there isn't going to be an explosion in the mine, we don't think. The office building is going to play an important part of our future.
It's quite amusing. You and I met over a discussion about lifts and elevators, and Marjorie Powell says, as long as there's a need for social distancing, tall buildings surely remain less usable because it takes too long for people to get up to higher stories. Quick comment on that.
Well, I know that from our own experience. We're on the 14th floor of our office building, and the landlord has said that only 2 people in an elevator at any time. Now, there are about 3,000 people in the building, so even though there are 8 banks of elevators, we reckon it could take you 8 hours to get to your desk on that basis. So, that's not going to work. There is an ability, of course, to create a elevator structure running outside the building, and that could be a new development so you create more elevator capacity. But perhaps at some point, with face masks or whatever, we still have to get back to 8 in an elevator and feeling slightly cramped in. But again, if the survey that we did earlier, 70% of the world being vaccinated will attract people back into the office. Well, I think once we reach that point, then perhaps there will be more relaxation, people feeling more comfortable about being crammed in with other people for a short time.
There are a lot of good comments here, and I will feed them to you, but I'm just going to try and squeeze in one last question comment. Certainly in my experience, there was great pressure from people who were having to do home teaching and having children at home. And a lot of that eased when the schools opened, which I thought was interesting because we never really speak about the babysitting component of education, which is interesting there. And Matthew Leach says, how much of the desired social contact is not work related? He thinks of young single people who would like opportunities to flirt. Well, that's not work related, but there are people with young families who would like to see them more if they have space to work at home without continual interruption. Aren't these the contacts where physical contact is important?
Well, a wide range of views on what's important, and certainly I won't go into them, but I think training. So from my experience as a solicitor, I was trained as an article clerk back in the day, and that involved being in an office, sitting next to a partner, listening to what the partner was talking to clients on the phone, how he handled clients, how they handled clients, and working on assignments that were then checked and reviewed by the partner. I think that is a key element of bringing that young generation through. And for my thinking, that is an element that can't be lost it will be lost through remote working. It's very difficult to replicate that. And for that reason alone, I think there will be a drive. If you want to attract talent into your business and get the young talent into your business, then there will be a social contract, which is to train that person so that they are in a position to face the future.
Well, this has been absolutely superb, Tim, and you really put a lot of work into this, and it shows. It's extremely thoughtful. Hugh Purser points out, as an aside, that psychologists say gossip is a vital part of human behavior, and one of the big losses in this pandemic. I often call it the buzz, and we try in these webinars to help people get some feel for what the buzz is rather than just a training session, and you've achieved that today. My personal views, for what they're worth, I think we've got a couple of paradoxes here. I mean, one is this idea that we want a low density commute to get to a high density area. And another one, I think, is we want to go to the office fewer times per week, or we think we'll be going to the office fewer times per week, but we anticipate meeting many more people in those times, which is the opposite of what we were thinking about when we said that we didn't want to go to the office because we didn't want that physical contact. So I think there's a lot that we're going to be learning as we go ahead. Anyway, if I may, 3 quick rounds of thanks. Firstly, to our sponsors who do allow us to range widely and freely. Your tolerance and generosity is always appreciated. We have more events coming up as ever. Do check out the website. But tomorrow is going to be quite interesting. David Craddock's going to be talking about, and you might find this strange, but it's deep and he's really thought about it. How could employee share ownership help meet the sustainable development goals? But finally, and most importantly, Tim, my thanks to you for a really thought-provoking presentation, and you've really lit up the board here. Unfortunately, I can't light up the board with applause, but I do bring my Korean karmic clapper, which will have to serve as fake applause for you. But I think we're all going to be looking forward to how this goes forward. And thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for listening.